The first and probably only rule of any warfare is never, ever underestimate your opponent. No matter what happens, you plan for everything because you never want to underestimate them. Which is why you hope for the best, but you plan for the worst. And it's a damn good thing we did, because after over 10 years, those damn critters came back again. Can't they just leave us alone? We hadn't even expanded the Terran hegemony anywhere since the whole Poltova incident. We just left it where it was. We were done. We were self-sufficient. We were good. Our population wasn't growing all by leaps and bounds or anything, so it was going to take a hell of a lot of time before we reached out. Almost none of these frickin' Xenos showed up ever, except to once in a while say hi just to see how we're going. Couldn't they just leave us the hell alone? But no, that's too much to ask now, isn't it? Ugh. I still remember that day. You would think it was yesterday. Oh, wait, it was yesterday when those idiots jumped into our territory. They jumped in without a word, and as we started to send communications, the only thing we got back was surrender or die. Yeah, that's a smart thing to say to Terran military. Surrender or die. You guys are idiots. Well, we thought they would aim at like Proxima 3 or something like that. Oh no, they actually jumped into the Sol sector. I mean, granted, they were Neptune orbit, although Neptune was on the other side of the sector at that point. Didn't matter. They came in and they made a beeline for Earth. What they forgot was that Mars was in the way, so they would be held back a little bit on that. But holy hell. I know they learned from their experience. It was pretty obvious to see. But didn't it occur to them in the slightest that we might have, upgunned a little bit, since last time was just one ship with just random civilian vessels that had some guns on them and got stomped, quite literally got stomped out of the sector. But here we are now, watching the replay of everything that happened. And what happened? Oichi mama. It makes me just want to go. Do they have brains up the back end of their carapace? Their fourth point of contact or something? Because that's the only thing I could think of for a good reason. They came in all weapons ready. And as soon as they jumped in, they began to launch fighter craft, which I find hilarious. Who the hell fights fighters in space outside of an asteroid field? Seriously, what in the ever-loving crap? Terrain dictates. Do they realize there's no terrain between Mars and them? It didn't take but 5 minutes before every single ship was on alert. Everyone was gearing up and everyone was getting ready. Though it would take a little bit longer for them to go sub-FTL all the way to Mars, Earth, and Venus, it was still going to be a tense couple of hours until then. We figured they would start firing any type of long-range torpedoes towards us. We were just working on experimental stuff at that point, and they thought, they just have their point defense cannons and those big guns. They have to be fairly close as far as space is concerned. No. You idiots. It was almost comical. As our first few battle groups started to join together, some coming from Mars, some coming from Earth, others coming from outside the sector, and just began to pull everything together. We're watching all this happen, and the Xenos are just continuing to advance. Maybe they thought they had a trick up their sleeve. I don't know, and I don't care. But seriously, our new turrets are energy-based. They're not projectile-based anymore. At least, not all of them. The main turrets, especially on the front of the ships, are set up as just massive particle beam cannons. What the hell were they thinking? I still remember watching, just watching the blips as the news looked over to see how far the enemy fleet was. They zoomed out so we could get a good idea, and we were getting live video and live sensor data from the front lines. They were that close. And just as our battle groups linked together to one main fleet, I still remember the Venusian fleet was going to take a minute to get there, but they simply said, "Go ahead and start the killing without us. We'll catch up." No, they didn't. As soon as they got everyone in formation, they got in standard spindle formation with our dreadnoughts midsection spaced out around the entire web. For those that don't understand, a spindle is a web. If you've seen a web, you know what I'm talking about. So they could maximize their weapons fire. They simply lined up well beyond visual range and launched beams across. But the kicker is these beams don't exactly pierce, they cut. So for several minutes, we just watched these beams slowly move and drape across the battlefield, covering such vast distances that you could actually see the beam bending as though it's a whip or a piece of grain waving in the wind as it's moving back and forth. And on the other end of these beams, atmospheres were being ignited. The ships themselves, the beams would cut into the hull just enough to light their atmosphere inside, and kaboom, there you go. Try breathing without an atmosphere, you dumbasses. You would think they would learn by now to at least decompressurize their units, but no. I swear, are we the only ones that were not the highest species on the planet when started out? How can these guys be so arrogant? Now, granted, they did try to fire their torpedoes, but they were completely outranged by ours. Ours were halfway there before they even fired their first round of torpedoes. And it was absolutely insane. We couldn't figure out what was going on with the enemy forces as our torpedoes just whipped past theirs, knocking a couple of them out. Surprisingly, they didn't detonate except for one, as it was an absolute perfect direct hit, and just whipped past each other. And before their ordnance even found their mark, we could just see more dots disappear, and on the video, more flashes in the ether. It was absolutely insane as we realized that more and more of their ships were falling apart, but they still advanced. As we realized that their battle group, their fleet was so large, it dwarfed ours easily 12-1. And we had only taken out maybe 20% at this point. And I stress the maybe part. But then we got the most interesting surprise from inside our own ships as they began to lock all their bulkheads in anticipation for the first volley of strikes. They got everything ready, and we could see video from inside one of our flagships as everyone brace, 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 and everything just bounced off the hull. What? Then suddenly we realized that was the initial dummy munitions. The torpedoes hadn't hit yet. And when they did, they didn't penetrate. They did explode, forcing many of our own ships out of formation, at least for a while, as they continued to move and their thrusters began blasting through the sky, trying to stabilize as best as they could. Many of our casualties came from simply being knocked out of their seats when they weren't ready. But even before that, they had already fired a second volley. This volley was tracking, and the fleets, even though they couldn't see each other, and it did take a minute or two before the ordnance actually reached, were simply flinging rocks at each other throughout space. And the waiting was the worst part, as you didn't know what was aimed at you. It could have been aimed at a ship behind you, beside you, you weren't sure, but your warning alarms were going off. I worried as many of my students were up there. Yet as the torpedoes started to pass a certain point, some sort of Lagrange point. Now, this is odd because it's a new thing with the new battleships, and I have not been briefed on it. It has something to do with you're in that formation, and that much mass causes some sort of distortion. But once the ordnance passed that point, there wasn't any stopping it. And right behind them, they waited and they waited until the perfect point to fire all their projectile main cannons as they whipped feverishly across the ether towards the enemy fleet. The enemy fleet probably didn't even know what was going on, as right behind the ballistics, another round of torpedoes was fired. And they waited. And they waited to see what else would happen. Maybe they would get scared off by this amount of damage. Who knows? Maybe they would do like the guy on TV. That's a lot of damage. But the waiting. They had to wait, as it seemed like the enemy fleet was having trouble setting the volleys of their torpedoes, as they were coming at 1, 2, 3, 4 at a time. This would not overwhelm the point defense systems, and they could easily be dispatched. And they had to wait, though. They had to wait for the ordnance to get close, and wait until the cannons had cooled off. As we all know, heat in space is a real bitch because it doesn't dissipate, and the cooling systems can only do so much. I remember, just for shits and giggles, I looked around to see if I could get a exterior view of one of the ships, and sure enough, the turret guns were still glowing hot. If they fired them again, they'd probably overload and explode. So it wasn't worth it. Yet off went another round of ballistics, and off went another round of torpedoes. I was wondering how many of those damn ships, how many torpedoes do they have? The Poltova didn't even have this many to shoot out. Oh, that's right. These are the new dreadnoughts, so they should be all sorts of fun to the party. And with that, the destroyers that were flanking them, the missile frigates that were all over the place, that just constantly launching everything. A torpedo frigate was even seen out there. I didn't even know those were commissioned yet. But it was just one right after the other as it went flying off. 18 tubes firing at once out of one ship. That's crazy. That's more than enough to take out one of their battleships. And across the ether, we again see more and more of their ships bursting. Several of the dots seem to fall out of formation, and they finally got close enough where we could get real time to see their ships. We could get a 3D image, and I looked, and sure enough, more than half of their fleet was adrift. Were they serious? It was this bad? At this point, you would think they would withdraw, but no, these stubborn sons of bitches decided they wanted to go whole hog, and they went straight towards our guys. And this time, they were not waiting for anybody. It seemed like at first they were trying to keep the fleet together, but no, this time they went full burn, or whatever they use in their engines to accumulate burn, and they came straight at our soldiers and our ships. Well, guess what? You still got a hell of a lot of space to cover, and we got a whole lot more guns to shoot. Because if there's one thing our Space Force love, they love them guns, and they continue to fire. The battle itself only lasted a few more hours. But that battle only went until the cannons cooled off enough that they could once again strafe across the universe and just zigzag those lasers across, ripping wholesale ships in half. Some of them quite literally sliced clean, as these particle beams do not explode, they slice. It was absolute carnage. And many people were laughing, because as you know, you can't have slaughter without laughter. Then we heard something that scared the crap out of us. Another fleet was coming in. It was from the same species. What the hell? Was that first one a diversion? It must have been, because the only ones even close were the Venusians. This fleet would be close enough that they would be within firing solution of Venus itself in about 3 hours. Unless they just fired dumb munitions, which that is exactly what they did. The Venetian fleet spun around, and one of their ships burned as fast as it could and fired one missile. Now, I couldn't tell if it was a missile or torpedo, but I've never seen any of our ordnance move that fast ever. This looked like an ordnance I had heard about, but I wasn't sure until it detonated. And as it detonated, it spread a mist across the entire battle group. And as it touched each group, the ships themselves seemed to fall apart, as though they were made of ash, and a breeze came up. They began to rip themselves to pieces as small bits opened up more and more. Their weapons began to fall apart. And as their ordnance began to start being ripped apart by the nanomachines that were now eating down through their engine compartment, they would explode. This would, of course, end the rest of his ship. And that was the end of the battle. 2 enemy battle groups dropped. And we didn't lose a single ship. It was interesting. Just before I started this, just as a reminder to myself to what happened, to remind myself this actually just happened. What we found in the alien transmissions as they sent more messages back to their home system, and they simply asked, "What the hell does it take to kill these things?"